welcome everybody online. You will soon get better quality than this. There. And welcome everyone in the room. I'm Camilla Bullock and I run the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And we are the branch organization for participants in the payments industry across APAC, so anybody who moves money. And we focus on policy and advocacy to enhance the payments industry with a vision of improving lives everywhere. And I've been doing this job for about 4 years. And when I started, I felt very much like a fraud because I did not have a payments background. But I have a data background, so I feel like right at home today. And over the years, I find every conversation we have around payments ends up in digital identity and then in data. So I'm super excited about this workshop that we're hosting together with APFF, so the Asia Pacific Financial Forum, and NZ Payments. So thank you very much for co-creating this workshop today, which will take us through 4 sessions. Hopefully it will soon be a very good experience for everybody who joined online from across the region and all the different markets, because we have structured today's workshop to try to take a little bit of a different angle on the opportunity that open data statement that's out there. I often get reflection when I talk about open data, open finance, open banking, that everything is so slow and nothing is happening. And I don't think that's true, because we are really aligning ourselves. It's a huge opportunity, and we can't really rush into it. So we're all about comparing best practice across the globe, but also to be aware that we're building for a robust ecosystem, something that is enabled and safe and secure. Because while we're building, new data points will emerge, we'll have to be ready and agile to extend that framework forward and capture those opportunities. So with further ado, I think I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, JT, who's the coordinator.
Okay.
Straight in from Japan, landed today.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And also I am the coordinator of the Asia Financial Forum, which is a platform for public-private collaboration that the finance ministers have established. But it is being managed by the private sector, by ABAC. So it's very unique in the sense that it's a platform that's owned by the government, but it's managed by the private sector. And I think that's ideal because we are, able to use our flexibility in order to bring a lot of stakeholders into the discussion. As you all know, APEC is a regional organization. Its goal is to promote free and open trade and investment. That is, of course, something that officials have been working on for many years, but in very recently, digitalization has, aside from bringing a lot of promise, also brought a lot of complications. And it's become complicated because a lot of the initiatives in digitalization is being done by individual economies, individual jurisdictions, with very little coordination among themselves. So this is, of course, a very important issue for APEC because we don't want to become digital islands that cannot connect with each other. So all of these efforts in the different economies has to be brought together and has to be coordinated. You also might have heard that COVID has changed a lot of things. Before COVID, we talked a lot about open banking, open data to different governments, and a lot of them were not very interested. But after COVID, all of a sudden, we heard a lot from central banks, from regulators. We want to go digital. We want to do open banking. We want to do open data. And so I think this is a good opportunity for us. And now we're joined by a lot of officials and regulators from APEC. We have invited the APEC Digital Economy Steering Group, Data Privacy Subgroup, and of course the finance ministers and officials to join us in order to expose them to what we are doing here. And the Asia Pacific Financial Forum, which is the platform for bringing together public and private sector. We have a lot of work streams, but this particular work stream is led by Camilla. And so we're, very happy that she has been very active in really pushing this issue. So this event that we're holding today is very important because we are starting the year in APEC under the chairmanship of the US. So the US is hosting APEC, and of course, a lot of the work in APEC, including the work of the finance minister's process, which is led by the US Treasury. So this is, I think, an important opportunity for us to start discussing this issue and to start discussing how do we encourage economies in the region to work on their open banking, open data initiatives in a way that will be interoperable. So, and that's why last year when we were discussing this, the recommendation that came out was we need to have guidance on common principles that can be considered by different economies. And hopefully, we're hoping to discuss this with the APEC groups this year, and hopefully this can this can get adopted as a sort of an approach that the 21 APEC member economies should be able to look at these common principles and develop their own open data and open banking systems in accordance with these principles with a view towards future interoperability. So that's a summary of what we're supposed to do. And so it remains for me to thank first our co-organizers, the Emerging Payments Association Asia. We of course would like to thank KPMG for providing us this venue for our discussion, and of course our panelists and moderators who have graciously offered their valuable time to share with us their perspectives today. And so with that, let me wish us all a very fruitful and successful workshop. So thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And it's a big talk. So after those workshops we had, it's a bit confusing where do we start. So then we always call our thought leaders, the people we trust for advice. So I called Saurabh at KPMG and I said, we had this workshop, he was a speaker, and he really shared a vision of what open data could be, especially the combination between data sets between sectors. So he helped a lot with the last report we wrote, and he's been helping to coordinate and structure the workshop today. So Saurabh, could I please introduce you as the MC today? And
Hi everyone, I'm Saurabh Shukla. I'm a director within the KPMG practice from Sydney. And in my role as a director, I co-lead CDR with Brett, who's sitting right there. And the work we do is across sectors. We help clients in banking, insurance, wealth, telco, energy. And we've done a lot of work on that front, helping from strategy to advice to architecture, compliance. We follow the full life cycle for a fair number of our clients. And it's in this regard I've got the opportunity to be your host because I've done a lot of work in this area. Our focus for today and my focus. So my focus would be to ensure we stick to time. We transition between events. If you see me coming and saying time, such that we are there for the next session. We've got 4 sessions planned for today. So the first session we talk about guiding principles around open data, right? And I find like talk about guiding principle for data. We pick that up and say, with those guiding principles, what are the use cases and local, regional data, payments, sectors, what does it look like? We move from those use cases to thinking about privacy and privacy enhancing technology. So how do we protect that data? How do we keep it safe? That's our third session. And on the fourth session, we talk about policy. So from a G20 level, what do we need to do at a policy level? Thinking about principles for data, use cases where value lies in the ecosystem, and then how do we protect what does need to be done at a policy level. So we have these 4 sessions planned, very exciting set of speakers, deep insights. And people online in the room, please don't hesitate in asking any questions. We have people monitoring the questions, which will be sent the panelists way. Right, so welcome any questions or contribution during the session. And to get started, I'd like to welcome Jane. Jane is GM of Strategy at Payments New Zealand, and she'll be hosting the first session.
Tihei Moriora, no mai, haere mai, ki te kaupapa o tēnei la. I ngā mana, I ngā reo, I ngā rauranga tēra mā, no mai, haere mai. He ngā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I just welcomed you here to Aotearoa, New Zealand, in our traditional Māori way, and just saying greetings to all from the four winds and who have gathered here and online for the kaupapa, for the agenda and the discussions that we have today. And for those that are in the room, we hope that the weather stays on side for you while you're here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But thank you, I'm the lead panelist because all of these people here, including myself, we could talk about open banking and open data, probably individually, without taking a breath for at least an hour and a half each, but we will try and you'll need to wrangle us at the time, give me the 20-minute call. We're just going to take you through today the journey that we've been on in New Zealand, in Aotearoa. And our open data journey starts with open banking. I'm the General Manager of Strategy and Corporate Affairs at Payments New Zealand. Payments New Zealand, we work with the industry, we govern clearing and payment clearing and settlement systems for about 7 trillion New Zealand dollars, all the kind of props up the economy. Obviously, payments is a cornerstone of the economy. And we also, with the industry, established what we call the API Centre several years ago, which is New Zealand's OBIE answer to open banking. We've led it first from the industry, and we're really pleased now that the government's coming in and looking at consumer data right legislation. But so we'll kind of take you on that journey, discuss principles and foundations of where we've got to, and I'd just like to introduce, and I'll sit down in a minute, I'll just introduce the other panellists. So we've got Jodie Bullen, who's the head of open banking at ANZ Bank, which is New Zealand's largest bank. Julia. Hi. Julia. From head of public affairs at Worldline, and Ashley Electrons, who's the CEO and co-founder of QuickPay, which is a fintech and payment startup here in New Zealand. So I'm gonna.
You can spread out a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's just very good. Very nice.
You can see.
Not too much competition.
So yes, if you can keep us to time, we've got a few things to cover today, but I'll just, we started with this journey, our journey to open data starts, as I said, with open banking. And it started out of our payments modernisation strategy here in Aotearoa. And that payment the first iteration of it was circa kind of 2016. And it was looking out into the future and identified more informative and informed like transactions and data, and this idea of simplified partnering and dynamic networks as the way of the future. So as we all know, the environment was changing, and as you said, with the digital evolution that was happening, we saw the need to ensure that there was less fragmentation in the market, there was more organisation around standards, and in this area, this is probably one of the first times where the standards have preceded the market and helped to enable the market, rather than usually what you do is standards and services and coordination comes once there's a lot of things in market and it needs a little bit more organising. So it's been a little bit different here, where we've started with an industry framework, with policies, with standards, with sandboxes, and we're really trying to encourage the market uptake of that. So we started off with a few foundations, and there are specific data principles that sit under that as well. But one of the first foundations is around simplification and being centrally organised, but the distributed delivery. So we just do what we need to do in terms of centrally organising our ecosystem through, as I said, standards, tools, policies, initiatives, but all the delivery is distributed out through the market, and they're best enabled, and they have the best knowledge of how they service their own customers and develop their own products and services. Another foundation is speed to market. So making sure that innovation, the simplified partnering, so that's quick, as quick as it can be. So how do we speed that up? So we've got a lot of focus on that. Optimal framework. So obviously we started here, which is a bit different to other jurisdictions, without a legislative mandate. And so we opted to put in this lighter touch framework. It's required to organise the industry, and as we've been learning and evolving, we've been putting in all the different components of that governance framework and that organisation that is actually required to get everything up and running. And some of the one of the key things that we've done, which we're just consulting on at the moment, is putting in what we're calling an implementation plan, which is mandating an implementation date for a certain version of the standard. And finally, just really encouraging innovation. We don't know what all the innovations are, so we just take a position that if we can create the environment that innovation can thrive, then very smart people in the market will come up with some really good ways to use those rails and get their products and services out the market. And just finally, your last principle, which I haven't mentioned, which is the most important one, is that we are about enabling New Zealand, Aotearoa's open banking future for Kiwi financial wellbeing. So for New Zealanders and for their financial wellbeing. And that often gets missed out in a lot of conversations, who the consumer is and who the customer is and who we're here to serve. So we always come back at the end of the day about, is this good for consumers? Is this going to help their financial wellbeing? And we have to recenter ourselves all the time with that. So anything else? That's I've just rabbit it on and probably took up about 5 minutes. Anything else?
I think that for me, the customer centricity piece is really important, because it really is the anchoring point of an industry collaboration, because it's not about self-interest or what one party wants to achieve. It always comes back to, well, where's the consumer view in all of this? How do we make sure we've got that covered? Are we really doing the right thing? And we're not just pressing ahead down one direction just to tick a box or to say that we've got interoperable technical standards, but what does that mean for consumers around trust, their protection? So when we talk about standards and what we're working on, it's much broader than just a technical set of integration standards, which I'm sure we're going to cover off a little bit more later on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Julia, did you have any thoughts to add to kind of where we started and why we kind of started with what we did?
Yeah, so we've been a part of this journey with Payments New Zealand since it was around 2016, wasn't it? When the API Centre was kind of created and developed. And I think for us as a payment service provider that has been in New Zealand since the 1980s and obviously uses legacy systems, but is moving towards the future and embracing things like open banking payments products and digital identity and data, trying to bring everything together and move it forward. It was really interesting to try to be ahead of legislation, because we saw legislation handed down overseas and it didn't result in products and services that consumers wanted to use, or data wasn't as easily accessible as people may have wanted, or the data they were getting maybe wasn't as clean or as useful. So actually being able to start that from the beginning with industry, with all sorts of people interacting and being part of the development of not only the technical standards, but the kind of industry framework, if you like, was really important. And I think now it's starting to show real value for New Zealand.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, we've been part of this journey for about a year. And one thing that we noticed quite early on is the ecosystem that gravitates around Payments New Zealand, really focusing on what's beneficial for the customer, what's beneficial for merchants, what's beneficial for New Zealand as a whole. And it's actually quite interesting because, we talk to our, theoretical competitors, and we talk to people in Payments New Zealand, and they all have very similar visions on how we can make this, a better place through open banking.
Yeah, so part of our kind of segues into our next discussion about kind of what's working well and why, and coming back to those kind of foundational drivers and principles. It was interesting when we started, we started, and I think other jurisdictions have done it as well, but we started with using, thank you very much, the OBIE standards. So, you know, we took what was already there and we looked at them, and I think we was about 80% of that standard was actually applicable here. So, you know, when we're thinking about cross-border interoperability of standards, there's a lot of functionality that we even know and looking at other people's standards that is useful. It's the same, and then you have to tweak it for kind of local market conditions. But we found, like, we ran a pilot, and some of our people in that pilot were running their own proof of concept, and we're actually looking at a proof of concept framework at the moment. So we really kind of iterated our way through, and I think that has helped us progress doing that pilot. I think without the pilot would have been quite a theoretical exercise and probably wouldn't have been industry driven, the support that we got to go ahead and implement it. Other thoughts on kind of what's worked well and why, based around those principles we started with?
I think we've tried to leverage what's already there, but also take the opportunity to learn at the same time. I think lucky enough we didn't go first, like the UK, and and while we took the technical standards and some changes made, I think for me what I think is working really well is that, you know, every week there's an industry meeting, you know, to discuss how we're going to solve certain problems for customers, and it's done in a view of each other's respective views. So whether you're a bank, there's interest there. So how do we continue to sustain trust? How do we manage privacy? How do we continue to maintain security and meet the regulatory obligations that we currently have around looking after people's money and their data? So how do you do that and start to promote innovation? And then from the fintech side, it's like, well, I didn't quite realize it was quite that hard. How might we work through that? What sort of things could we do? And there's numerous examples where we've made some very sensible decisions by having everyone at the table, where we've been able to make sure we're taking a more risk-based approach, still customer-centric, but still can provide a framework for innovation. So ultimately, there's some areas in there which I'm sure we'll get to later around that we're going to need to tackle still, but that collaboration has been really important. I think it's worked really well.
Yeah, are there some examples of what we've been working on in the business working group?
So there's a few. I mean, we've worked on a lot. I think the key thing is the technical standards. When you think, oh, look, we can just take what's already overseas and we can just work on that. I always talk about open banking as 3 levels to create it really simple. You've kind of got your technical, your operational, and then your kind of commercial partnering. And then arguably you could say there's another one, which is actually the entire ecosystem itself. And so just building out technical standards that can move data in and out doesn't actually get you to the outcome, which is partnering and customers using new propositions that didn't exist before. So actually you have to think about it as an ecosystem view, as a system view, and as a new product and service that's going to come out. So I always sort of align it to the likes of a direct debit that customers understand and they know what they're going to get when it's going to work. So or FPOS. So if you think about that model where actually in order to provide the innovation, you actually do have to have the framework, the principles, know how it's going to operate, the rules are then getting, not just the technical standards, but actually how they're going to work. So just one bit on there in terms of practically what we can work on is an area around recently, we've had lots of conversations around customer consent. When I first took on open banking, it was actually what we're really building is consent, because that's what drives. And so, you've got multiple dynamics in terms of that, in terms of, existing privacy obligations, existing mandates for the banks, overseas of how they've tackled it. And some have gone very heavy with multiple levels and 5 different types. And we said, well, how do we navigate that in a way that could accelerate adoption, make it easier for customers to understand? And I think we've reached a really good principle-based approach that will hopefully meet all of those requirements without costing, tens of millions of dollars for everybody to build. Yeah, that helped, Jane, in terms of an example.
Yeah.
What about you, Julie?
I was just going to add to the consent topic. So when we were first looking at the framework, we were quite conscious that New Zealand's privacy legislation is not as robust, shall we say, as some overseas jurisdictions. So as an industry, we decided that we wanted to, go best practice, and we kind of could then. So we were looking at it and saying, look, you know, there's a lot of businesses that are going to be mindful of the GDPR, the European regulation, and so that is kind of the gold standard. So anything we're developing here, we want to make sure wouldn't fall foul of maybe some more stringent obligations elsewhere. We also thought that, you know, if we put forward this really robust framework, should, you know, there be some legislation later on, they'll be thinking, oh, you've done a really good job, you've been mindful of what's happening overseas, you've really taken care of the New Zealand consumers, which we know is, you know, what the regulators are mostly interested in. So I think having that kind of knowledge base and understanding was actually really good to work together, and everybody wanted it to be a really good framework. It wasn't kind of, you know, let's rush this together and try and stave off regulation. We really wanted to do it properly.
Yeah, again, I would agree on the last one, so I'm just agreeing with you all. Same point, but yeah, I think for us, it's been, you know, the two things with, you know, in New Zealand, we have the benefit of hindsight. We can see what's worked and what's not worked in Australia, UK, and Europe. We can take that knowledge and apply it within the working groups, which I think is a great forum when you have banks and fintechs and from all different backgrounds, having different perspectives, being able to work and collaborate together to work for the best interest of the ecosystem, which I think done quite well, and I'm, you know, quite excited about the POC. I'm quite excited about the consent discussions.
Yeah, because it's important to bring everyone together, isn't it? Because like us as a standards organisation or an industry organisation trying to pull people together, you need the people that are out. You need that knowledge. People need to bring their knowledge of their own customers and their products and service and how everything kind of works in the background to the table, don't they? Or else you just kind of coming up with a lot of theory that you can create in a standard or in guidelines or in principles or policy, and they're just not useful to create something that's kind of market facing. And so that's where these our kind of foundational attributes of the framework that we've put in, like kind of keep testing us, you know, as not only do you need inherent safety, you know, but and to generate trust, but is the simple, is there, you know, have we put in unnecessary complexity? Yes, no. Can we get it to market quickly if there was a couple of partners that want to do it? Yes, no. Is this something that's common and can be kind of extensible across many people? Yes, no. And you kind of work through those frameworks to prioritise what needs to.
I think the different groups are really useful as well. So, you know, there's a technical working group that's made up of technical experts. There's a business working group, which is kind of more customer focused and what's products and services and what's, you know, not obviously talking about the commercial model between the competitors or the people in the room, but, you know, how is this going to be viable? How, you know, how are we going to make revenue? And then, you know, we had a legal group. That was fun. That was lots of fun, I must say. Yes.
A whole range of lawyers.
I know, that was amazing. Fun. But the fact that, you know, everybody in the industry put forward people, invested a lot of time, you know, that's a lot of time and money coming from all the different organisations to try to achieve something ahead of the game, and that would be useful, and we all kind of suffer later on when some regulation arrives.
And I often get asked, how did you get, particularly the banks, how do you get the banks involved? You know, like why are the banks involved? And because it started from this modernisation strategy where there's multiple components. There's real-time payments. I think there's a round table next door talking about that. You know, there's many things that you need, and when you've got that industry strategy, you're all working towards a bigger purpose. But I think without that, we would have gone round and round in circles, but we could always kind of pick it back. We still go round and round in circles. And actually, you can start on this. We've just said all the great things. And we're Kiwis too, so like we can talk about all the things that aren't going on.
I tend to be optimistic about the open banking ecosystem here, but I suppose, I mean, when we joined about a year and a half ago, things were a little bit slower. API readiness wasn't ideal. At the time, I think there was something being said that API available to the market. that's beginning to change, however. I mean, it's, I think largely, and I think Jody can speak more to this, about, banks dealing with their own regulatory monsters not being a priority. They have to tackle these ones in order to tackle open banking, but that wasn't ideal at the time. And I think what happened as well is third parties looked at alternate solutions like screen scraping or reverse engineering mobile applications. What's good about that is it does allow for use cases in the market. The problem is that the consumer has to hand over the banking credentials, which is quite a bit of a risk for the consumer and the banks. But what we're seeing now is, which is great, more banks come to the table and more APIs getting released and the bilateral process getting streamlined. I think that's largely due to the use of the bank getting toned down. Yeah, so it's quite an exciting time to be in open banking as things are sort of moving forward.
I think you picked the right time to come in because we've been boxing away at it for a number of years. It has been a long time. It's been a stroll, not so much of a sprint, but we were convinced that there was going to be some good outcomes and that, this is the way, right? This is the way we think for payments. So we were determined to keep on with it. So it has taken a while, but we have got there.
And I think this working group has talked about that in the past, haven't they, Camilla, about how long it's actually taken. And I think, as you're both saying, and Jody was saying, that just conceptually, like it seems like really easy for a bank to expose an API. Well, maybe for those that don't work in banking, it's really very easy. But it hasn't been, because this type of environment needs scale. And to create scale, you need to architect your systems to enable that to happen. And that has taken across the ecosystem like so much longer than what anyone here anticipated. Jody,
I just think you've got to measure success. It depends on how you're measuring success, right? And what speed really means. And if you look at the UK, I mean, if you look at the timelines that any jurisdiction has taken, especially those earlier ones, it does take a long time. It is incredibly complicated, both at the technical level, operationally, certainly, from a bank perspective, trying to move ahead and open up in a non-regulated environment when you already have regulations that are kind of counter. And, even things like, the banks, certainly the Australian banks, that we have a regulation through APRA, and to put anything in the cloud is like a 200-page checklist sort of thing. So then it's like, well, how does that apply for third parties in this kind of model? And you have to work for all of those kind of challenges. So the operation is really complicated, it takes time. And so even though the UK has done, they've done a great job, they have learned, they've pioneered, they've still only reached 7 million users, right, in like 6-7 years worth of effort. So again, you can say, okay, well, yeah, they might have been faster, their banks might have got it out, but they got their technical standards out and then spent 3 years overlaying an op model, a partnering model, and building all the networks. And I think they're probably now at a tipping point. They've got about 300 accredited third parties that you're going to start to see some volume growth. So I think for me, one of the good things about this collaboration is not only building the services, it's actually working through the operating models, the shared clarity. That's going to make partnering easier in the long term. It means that we are going to be in a position as a country where, yes, we're going to have a consumer data right, and it will be standardized. But that's only going to provide certain data sets or under certain conditions. And so actually, if you want to do innovation, and then there's going to be this sort of commercial aspect to that. And so I think we're, as a country, we're going to be in a much better position for both standards under CDR, but also from a commercial partnering perspective. I think that will be really good. Interestingly, the UK has done it the other way around, and now they're trying to work out how to do commercial partnering on the next set of standards that aren't going to be regulated. And so they're trying to happen to reverse it backwards. So I think we're in a good position for that reason, but it does take time. So
yeah, it does. And I was just in the UK recently I met with some people at the OBIE and Chile and whatnot. And it was quite interesting because you would think that further down the line, being 4 years in, but I think it was only 400 or so registered third parties, and there's still slightly disheveled, like VRPs fit outside of the OBIE framework. So they still need to bring that back in. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And to Jody's point, I think the fact that and Jane's point, we standardize the APIs first, that we can roll out CDR in a much more effective way.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to how that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, that was fantastic.
We have time for questions or no?
Do we have questions?
I don't think that, because are we still looking technical to try to get it on? Yes, have to, so maybe people online, this might be a little bit messy for you, so Rob, maybe you can take one question while they do the technical,
Sure.
so to our people here.
Any questions from the group?
Okay. Tell me about government. So government's come in, data right, how does this group of people, particularly Payments New Zealand, interact with government and how that changes it?
Yeah, well, hopefully, government and us, as Jody said, you know, we've formed this kind of collaboration. We're hopeful that we can collaborate together, because what a waste it would be for all of this work and, you know, deeply technical and subject matter expertise kind of work that's sitting here. I think Phil, our API Centre Manager here, counted up. This collaboration, you know, our API Centre and our partners have spent over 100,000 hours since our establishment on setting up our open banking framework. And you just couldn't replicate that again from government. So we want to work with them. We have identified through various projects that we've done, particularly in partnering, where we really think that the government and legislation is needed to help grow the industry. So due to kind of competition, law boundaries and stuff, there's some things that we can't actually do within the bounds of the Commerce Act, like potentially accreditation regimes or some of the stuff around liability allocation and stuff. So that's really where, and we've been talking to the government. MB's actually an observer on our governance council for this, and they're across our work. So we're hoping they will work, particularly in open banking, obviously, with us.
I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think the announcement that banking was going to be the first industry to be designated under consumer data right indicated that they were confident with the work the industry was doing. I think, you know, they could have gone with health or telco, like they would both be industries that would provide some really real benefits from open data. But I think because as an industry we've been working together, they feel reassured that if they chose banking, that it would be a good place and we would do a good job. And we talk to them a lot. I think many of the
there's definitely components of an open banking ecosystem that absolutely require a regulator.
template agreements, for example, would be great, but we can't agree to those.
That's great and fantastic. What I took away from your session as guiding principles, firstly, having a customer-led approach and having them at the center. Secondly, you mentioned the pilots and learning from what other geographies and jurisdictions have done, so not reinventing everything. Thirdly, the industry consultations, so involving everyone, taking them on the journey. Fourthly, thinking about the broader ecosystem beyond just benefits for individual parties, right? And what that would mean for you, and perhaps for New Zealand, is thinking beyond banking. What does the whole ecosystem look like? What do we mean? What are the ambitions we can achieve as an economy, and having a bigger picture in mind. And I think lastly, not ignoring the risk, privacy, and the risk-centric approach as we embark on this journey. So as the barriers to data are lowered, there's a heightened obligation on us to think about how do we protect that data. Thank you so much. It's very insightful.
Thank you.
For the next session, our focus is on thinking about those principles, but what are the use cases for the ecosystem? And as we think about those use cases for this session, and based on the session we're thinking accessibility, interoperability, scalability, but with risk and security in mind. We've got three amazing set of speakers for this session. Firstly, we've got Sonia. She is the Chief Data Officer at Westpac. She is responsible in her role to mature the data capability and drive superior outcomes for the customers and for the group. She's also responsible for innovation and developing new business models using data. In her previous roles, she has been instrumental in driving innovation outside banking in payment and retail and food industry. Also quite pleased to say, last year, Sonia was listed as one of the top 100 influential people in data. The second panelist, Nicholas, I hope he's there. Nicholas is, just want to check if we have Nick. I don't see him.
Hi everyone.
Coming up. There he is. Thank you, Nicholas. Nicholas is Chief Data and Innovation Officer at Aboitiz. He's based out of Singapore. In his role, Nicholas looks at industrializing artificial intelligence and machine learning models. He's pragmatic of he's proud of looking at pragmatic side of the world and bringing real life experience and making production services out of data. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas.
Thank you.
Thirdly, and not the least, Emily Martin. Emily has been pivotal in shaping the role of CDR in Australia. She's based out of Sydney. She is part of the Australian Treasury, the policy arm. So in Australia, the Treasury is responsible for shaping the CDR regime. Emily works with the other regulators, namely ACCC, Office of Information Commissioner, and the other industry stakeholders in rolling out and owning the CDR reform. Again, please join me in welcoming Emily.
Hello.
That's it. Now, I think thinking about the use cases, I'll go to Sonia first. And we started the previous session about customers. I was curious to understand for the customers, what may be top of mind when we think open data, CDR? What are some of the things that may excite them? What are some of the things that may concern them?
It's a really good question. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have my back to most of the audience who's facing the camera.
Can we accomplish it?
So that's okay. You'll just bear with me. So when I think about customers, and I do think about it in different ways. So we have the consumer at the end of the day, whose data it is. And, when you think about their needs, they're looking for reduction in friction, they're looking for accessibility, they're looking to understand their position. So perhaps it might be speed to decision on a loan, or it might be help immediately wherever they are, particularly when we're thinking about regional use. And, keep me safe. This is a really big deal. And there's huge opportunities with open data to help facilitate that, but also there's danger with it. And so if we don't get it right, you can actually put our consumer into a worse position. And that then leads to the understanding. So if the consumer doesn't understand and they make a poor decision and their data goes to the wrong place, then what are we doing and who's responsible for helping them? So I think there's a really big piece there in education and understanding that's important. When I think about the business customers, the piece for me, and actually talking to my counterpart who's been visiting from Australia today, rich, scalable data sets. If at the moment, and I was sort of saying, well, why is Australia not really smashing us out of the ballpark? And his view on it, which I tend to agree, is right back at the beginning. I'm like, well, how are you going to get to a tipping point? So if you need rich, scalable data sets, but you need individual consent on a case-by-case basis for a specific purpose, then that's a heck of a lot of work to get to a tipping point to create enough scalable data to deliver a fantastic service from. So I think there's some real learnings from the Australian experience and probably from the UK as well that we could take forward and think about. Solving a real problem and the value proposition is key. So when we think about, we're talking all about banking, I actually don't agree. So I think the biggest opportunity is actually getting the right value proposition. So if we thought about the complexity and all the things we have to work through to make this right, it's easier to pick a case. So if we picked climate change, something we can all share as a problem, regionally we can share this as a problem. If we could put in place the right standards, controls, etc., to make that work, then I think we're onto something. At the moment, we have completely different ways of labeling and understanding data. And if you are taking a standard controlled approach to solve a real problem, I think it makes it a lot easier to get there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And the part on how to start thinking about banking. Nicholas, if I can pass it on to you, also from a regional perspective, and in your role, what are some of the observations you have made about the customers, their expectations, and what would they like to see?
Okay. So as a Boitis,
You're
we
mute, Nicholas.
Is this on mute? This was I was worried about.
no, it shouldn't be mute. Can you hear me now?
Nicholas, is it
on mute?
Nicholas,
You're connected here.
we can hear Nicholas.
So you can hear me, correct?
Yes, I can hear you, Nicholas.
Okay, beautiful.
Yep.
So at a
I'm actually
Boitis,
at 20. I just look all for all those technical issues going on.
oh, so people on the call can hear me, but not in the room, it looks like.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
seems to be what's going
Just
on.
hold on, Nicholas. We'll come to that.
Okay.
Speak.
Can you go? Nicholas?
I can speak again.
Awesome.
Can you hear
Thank
me in
so
the room
much.
now?
We can.
Ah, that's an advantage.
Yes.
Okay, so nice to meet you all. I can say it now again. So at Aboitis, we work mostly in Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. So that's going to be the scope I can observe. And my past experience has been mostly in Singapore. So if we put ourselves in the context of open data, I think today it's mostly seen through two lenses. The first lens would be the lens of data shared by governments in the region. And the goal really is to get data that allows us to have a deeper view on customers' habits, behaviors in the region. Another lens is sharing of data across companies, which is a broad and deep topic at the same time. So we have at Aboitis, we are conglomerates, and Southeast Asia is full of conglomerates, which are trying to share data across each other in different countries and within the conglomerate itself. Now, sharing data even privately within a company is kind of making it open in the mind of the employees of that company. And so as soon as we enter these data sharing discussions, what we observe is a lot of commercial willingness, of business willingness to do it, but also from the practitioner's perspective, a lot of resistances to actually go through the sharing agreement. Now, if I go back, to the aspect of what I would call government level data, what we observe also is leadership at the level of Singapore with setting expectations and best practices on how to share data, and regional governments trying to get to that level. Now, from my personal experience, I've been using open data from the USA, from France a few years ago. And what I noticed actually, we may have the perspective that in Southeast Asia, it's not at the same level, but actually it's not that far because open data is still a very new concept. And even in Western Europe, even in North America, it's actually not easy to find good open data shared by government agencies. And so I've often heard comments saying that in Southeast Asia, in this or that country, it's really hard to get access to data from the government. But as compared to other countries, I don't think it's completely accurate. And to me, it's roughly at the same level. Now, what is important, and that's really to echo on the previous point, by Sonia, I think, it's about standards and labeling of data. I've often seen government agencies sharing data completely unlabeled with esoteric formats that very few people comprehend, and in an obvious attempt at appearing to participate to open data, probably on some impulse. But when we see good initiatives like, for example, open data in the Singapore government, I think it's opendata.gov.sg, or the New York City Open Data Laboratory, you have very good ways to share data in a way that is respectful of the individuals, where there's no private data being shared, yet in a format that is consumable by the industry.
Thanks for that, Nicholas. And Emily, may I please pass it on to you from a regulatory perspective, knowing that you're thinking about everybody, so consumers, businesses, regions, sectors. What are some of the concerns you're seeing, and how are the regulators reacting to those?
Wow, okay, that's a big question. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I think what I would just say, firstly, just to set the context of what's happening in Australia and the approach that we've taken, picking up on the previous panel and just some of the comments that my other panelists have made. The approach in Australia has always been that our consumer data right will be a whole of economy data right. That's extremely ambitious. That's talking about a whole range of data sets. And so the way that we've gone about that has to start in banking, particularly, looking at other jurisdictions and where they started their open data journeys. That seemed the sensible place to start. But moving on from open banking, we've recently launched into energy. And we've been in a process of writing the rules and standards for telco as well. We've undertaken a strategic assessment approach as well in 2021 that looked at, a rapid kind of assessment of the economy and where the value would be in expanding the consumer data right next. And a lot of the factors that Sonia was talking about, prioritising data sets that could support multiple use cases, that focus on friction points for consumers, that consider how the CDR might interact with other data sharing mechanisms, the maturity of ICT infrastructure in different sectors, how we can prioritise data sets coming into the CDR that build on the existing data sets and are complementary to those to support ecosystem growth. And that's where we got to open finance. So we've recently consulted on non-bank lending, and we'll move into the sector of superannuation and insurance as well. And that's really about giving consumers that full financial picture.
Puta ka, Iboy. Ikaw ang tunay na pokpok.
I think there's some people not on mute, so I'm getting a bit of disruption.
Yeah, I think we've got Dan and Sydney trying to mute people.
It flicks my screen off so then I can't see anyone. They sound like they're having a lot more fun than I am. So in terms of we made the decision in Australia that we would start with, read access for data sharing. And we've been on that journey for a couple of years now. We've only really just completed the data sets coming into open banking with the full data being available at the end of last year. So I think one of the challenges is that to build an ecosystem, it takes time and it takes a lot of collaboration and dedication. It was really great to hear the previous panel talking about working with industry. I think the journey in Australia, we've become a lot better at engaging with industry and working through the technical detail at an earlier stage. We're at the point now where we have legislation in our parliament to enable action initiation, so that right access. But we're already, setting up workshops through our data standards body to start the initial conversation about technical standards, even though we are, realistically quite quite far away from implementation of action initiation. You know, I think one of the challenges, and particularly for me being in government and convincing government to keep investing in this, and our private sector to keep investing, is that it's transformative. It is a reform. It takes time to build and to realise those benefits. And where you might start in a sector like banking and you think you bring in all of the data, as you progress through other sectors, we have decided to be much more, you know, strategic and think about those data sets in a use case way, and how things can complement other data sets and what would really be of benefit to consumers. It's quite a journey, and there's a lot of collaboration and working with industry that needs to happen to keep progressing it.
Thanks a lot on that, Emily. I think what we're hearing is, like, I guess in some ways, perspectives around personal data, government data, non-sector data. And a question I had for the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Sonia, where you told me earlier that within the bank, for example, you've got 150 years of data. But is it enough data, or is it the right set of data? Can I get your perspective, and as Emily's talking about thinking about prioritization, where value lies, what are the things we need to think about? And we've said we want to think about the customer, but there's still that balancing act around how much safe, is it in me, is it outside in the ecosystem? What do you think the regime or the regulators or the industry need to do to get to specifics as well? Because absence of specific direction means we go in many directions and there isn't enough alignment. And when I hear these conversations, I think, what can we, and when we go and talk to clients or people, they say, what's going to happen in the next 18 months? What can we bring to life, right? The people who are excited, the people who are concerned that what happens when all of this comes into play.
Absolutely. I think from a banking perspective, we are in a better, or getting to a better position. So 161 plus years of data. But you know, that legacy is not easy to get to. So you find it's trapped in multiple systems. And fintechs will find this too. If you keep replacing and bringing in new technology, it's very hard to decommission the old. And so you're faced with complexity as a result of that. But also, it's not all the data that you need. It's lots of data, but it's not all the data you need. So when we think about how do you turn this into something meaningful, we already have some activities in play, both through APRA and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand regulators, that are looking at simplifying the data landscape for data sharing. And so we already provide data to government, non-personal, that allows government to have a view of the health of the country, and looking at things like business health indexes and inclusion and climate and things like that. So we, in both Australia and New Zealand, we actually have a program of activity at the moment where we're producing data products that are standardized to be able to facilitate API sending of data. What a great basis for open data. So instead of reinventing the wheel, let's use something that's already in play, but think about the use case off the back of it. I think also where we get to with, you know, when you think about those use cases, if it's really going to be valuable, then I think I'd fast track that telco conversation, because, you know, in a partnering relationship, our group team have already joined up telco data and bank data in order to prevent spoofing. So this is where scammers have pretended to be bankers. And so what a great use case. It's got exceptional value. There's a very good reason for that data to be joined. There's a lot of learning in the process. You're introducing new standards and controls as a result of the work that you're doing, but it's based on actually delivering something meaningful.
Thank you, Sonia. And Emily, can I pass it on to you? And I think one of the challenges which we're facing now as consumers or within the economy is the cost of living pressures. And you also mentioned cross-sector assessments, which you've led as part of the CDR work in Australia. Would you share what has been the focus from a regulatory perspective as you're thinking about prioritization around what data, right? And the other part I hear across in that area from like a lot of organizations who need to comply is it's very easy for the regulators to come and say, share everything, but who's going to use that data? What's the utility for it? How are you finding or juggling that balancing act in terms of driving innovation, lowering barriers to entry from a data perspective, but at the same time, thinking about those other aspects as well as you prioritize those data sets?
Yeah, so I think you can see from the way we have prioritised the data sets, there is an emphasis on personal financial management. So having that full financial picture, understanding, the power of being able to see, all of your accounts and transactions in the one place, and to have a third party perhaps draw some insights from that and help you manage towards savings targets or better smooth your bill paying, or see where you're possibly spending too much, or should you be making that gym membership donation each month, and those kind of things if you're not going. So there is a lot of potential there in terms of consumers being able to utilise the CDR through third parties to manage their personal finances. We want to be able to, further that, and that's through deepening, the functionality of the CDR and bringing in action initiation, which initially, we may, the thought is that we would focus on payments and being able to manage those, bring together the power of data sharing and action initiation to enable a whole lot of use cases that can benefit consumers. I think from a government perspective, there's a lot of interest in aligning the objectives of the CDR in terms of safer, more secure data sharing than what actually happens in the unregulated market. We're particularly seeing that with the exploration of use cases in energy and trying to align that. That's obviously a big cost pressure for households, but also aligning that with climate change objectives and thinking about how which households can benefit from solar energy and how could they finance that? What's their energy usage? Is it worthwhile? Does it make economic sense for that kind of household? We don't have those use cases in the market yet, but they would be nice, and they would align with a lot of different government objectives, which would be good. The second part of your question has just slipped my mind. Sorry.
I was just asking about the balancing act and how you're trying to say how much would be enough, right? Because there's
how much data is enough?
Yes.
That's a hard question. No amount of data is ever enough. And I think that's what I was kind of alluding to in my previous comments, that when we move into open finance and we are looking at non-bank lending and moving particularly into superannuation and insurance, we keep talking about targeted data sets. To bring a whole sector of data in insurance would be incredibly complex, but also not necessarily beneficial. So what are those data sets that are really going to benefit consumers in understanding their personal financial position and the decisions that they need to make about something as important as insurance, particularly in a world where we're seeing, increased kind of climate change generated events and natural disasters and things like that. So a lot of things that are out of consumers' control. I think we've been pretty ambitious today in terms of the data sets that we want to bring into this, that we have brought into the CDR, and that's where we, you know, have some more work to do when we think about product data, and so having that useful for consumers so that they can make those comparisons of different products. That's really difficult because sectors obviously try to differentiate themselves on the products that they offer. So there's not, you know, standardized information that can be easily compared. So there are issues in that space that we need to work through, and it is, you know, it is a balance, and it is a challenge. I think at the heart of it, we just keep focusing on what will be that consumer benefit.
And Emily, one of the other things I wanted you to touch upon was the from a government perspective, both as a data holder and as a potential future data recipient. So data held by them, but at the same time, thinking about citizens and saying, ours is there data government can receive, which may in turn help the citizens. Is that top of mind? Is it coming? Is it being thought of?
Definitely being thought of. So the strategic assessment process that I spoke about in 2021 made, you know, I came to a conclusion that government data is a rich source of data, a very valuable source of data. It's a source of data that a lot of sectors want to have access to. It's a source of data that a lot of consumers want to have access to. So we have been thinking about government data and government as a data holder and government as a data recipient. Once again, we are taking an approach of, you know, what's the use case? What's the benefit to consumers? Obviously, you know, there's a lot of other legislation and regimes and frameworks that govern government data. So it's something that we have to, you know, work through quite carefully. But it's definitely something that we're thinking about. You know, one such use case that often gets raised with us is small business lending. So when we talk about consumers in the consumer data right, we do include small businesses as consumers, and being able to, you know, bolster those lending applications with ATO data. That's, you know, been something that has been raised with us continually. Obviously, that's something that's really complex and really difficult to progress, but that doesn't mean that, you know, we won't be thinking about it, because we are, and there's a lot we have to think through. How do you accredit a government agency in a regime that's been set up for, you know, private sector accreditation and things like that? So there's a lot of issues to work through, but it is something that we see as really important, and it is something that the Assistant Treasurer is also keen to prioritise.
And so when we think about the region itself, we've had a good conversation on consumers. And I think how JC said earlier, we don't want to be digital islands. And when I reflect on what we see today, some of these use cases too are very hard to bring to life just in one country, right? With like the education challenge, there's an awareness challenge. We're operating in so many disparate regulatory frameworks, like from a competition perspective, Privacy Act perspective, and then we've got regulations for banking, different regulations for energy. I was curious about, and I think what Nicholas, you said earlier about conglomerate and working in those regions. I was curious about from the panel about where do you see opportunities for a regional cooperation and like realization of use case. So when I think cooperation, I'm thinking, where should regulators be cooperating? And then when I think realization, what are the use cases we can bring to life? Maybe we start with you, Nicholas, if you may have a perspective with where you sit.
Okay. So that's a very, very interesting and difficult question.
That's my job here.
Sorry?
Sorry, my role as a moderator, ask you difficult questions.
Yeah, that gives options, which is nice. Now, a couple of things. So first, in terms of, I would say, regional cooperation, one typical pain point we have is the fact that privacy regulations are quite different from one country to another. Different both in details, but also in how protective they are of the data of individuals and how precise they are. PDPA in Singapore is fairly precise in what you can and cannot do. The equivalent in the Philippines is extremely, I would say, written a very gray area. You can interpret it in very different manner depending on your own mindset, which actually makes people even more defensive. They see in the newspaper these articles about Google, Meta being fined hundreds of millions of dollars for not respecting GDPR. And then they think, okay, I need to be careful about that. And this law is new and not very precise. And so that leads effectively to a lot of paralysis in discussions around the usage of data. And I've seen that very clearly in the Philippines, in Indonesia, where the legal frameworks being new and not precise lead people to effectively avoid making decisions. And so one, I think, key but difficult area of harmonization is to go towards, using those privacy agreements that generally have proven to be effective, GDPR, PDPA, as a basis for alignment. And I know it's going to take time, but if we end up in the region having 10 different ways to be able to use private data, it's going to make any sort of open data initiative much more complex. So that's one element. A second element, which is more on the industry cooperation aspect, is typically when we talk about sharing data, the discussion when it's a data set that is not yet open always start with discussions on the regulatory aspect. Is it anonymized properly? Is your data encrypted? How is it stored? And it can happen, and I'm sure you have been in situations where discussions can last months or even years on this topic without really progressing to the point where both parties are ready to actually share data and start working. Now, what we've observed, having been many such discussions, is that the key reason why there's no progression is not really the technical / anonymization / encryption aspect, but actually a fundamental problem of trust, which is I'm about to share my data with you, and we're saying we're going to use it in that context. But because I don't really trust you, I'm afraid that you're going to use my data in ways I don't control and I do not know. And that's what's hiding behind all these discussions on the technical aspect of sharing data. And so what we've come up with at Aboitiz, because we have all these problems both internally and with external corporations, is okay, let's address the problem of trust. And let's say that it's not about sharing data, but about letting others access data. So it's a shift of discussion. And so to that regard, what we've done is to create an environment where the person providing data lets the consumer have a look at the data and work on it without actually sharing the data, by effectively using environments that are self-contained, do not allow extraction of data, but allow working on the data. And the outcome we get from that is to be able to go from a high-level discussion on, okay, we have an idea to use data, to here's a proof of concept that shows how we will be able to use this data if we sign this data sharing agreement, if we find a way to share the data. And having that proof point, that effective use case that shows point by point how data will be used, allows to unblock these discussions, because as long as you stay in the realm of concepts and objectives, it can be really hard to motivate the key decision makers to say, okay, let's push people to actually share the data. And so this self-contained private environment really are very helpful to share data. And I use the word share, but actually it's to let others access data and work on it. Because you can click a button and stop the cooperation if you realize the other party is misbehaving, which is the fundamental problem of trust.
Understand. Now, thanks a lot for that, Nicholas. I'm conscious we're heading towards the end of our time as well. If I can go to Sonia quickly, and then to Emily in terms of what she's saying. But regional, do you see potential? Do you see it still far off?
I think absolutely there's potential, and I completely agree with the need to build trust. We need to move for this to accelerate, we need to move from policy, which is important, but into trust and belief. And to do that, you need transparency. We also need to build the ethical framework. So if we're thinking about massive scalable data sets, you're talking about machine learning. And if we go into that space, we need to have a really good solid agreement and understanding about the ethics, which also links to transparency. And then the last one, I think also to really free this up, I think our identity needs to be addressed and built into it, so that if you're trying to join sets, how are you going to join and see that consumer? Then how does that consumer get to see their data from end to end and manage it and withdraw it if they wish? So completely agreeing with Nicholas's conversation there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Over to you, Emily, and I think it's probably a loaded one, hearing this, right? So probably two parts to the question. Is that a focus from a government perspective in thinking about the regional use cases and the regulatory structure we need to have? And I think the second part of that question, which we've heard today, is there's this tricky challenge about having scalable data sets, but finite consents, right? And we may enter into a world with so many consents and with so many data sets. Is that in the visibility of, like, from a regulatory and a policy perspective about challenges which we need to address? Or in the short run, we're trying to get the regime going and these are more for some time in the future?
To do that briefly, look, I think it's a bit of both. So the work that we're doing here in terms of, expanding across different sectors, and when we're thinking about rules and standards and the process and the customer experience, I would say that we have an eye to one day linking up with other systems and having that kind of regional usability. We're certainly not thinking about a completely, closed off system, but it is a challenge for that very reason, that we are still in the build, phase, and still in that situation of wanting to generate the uptake, the use cases, the products and services here in our market. But at every level, like in terms of, we are always looking to other systems, and we are always engaging, with other jurisdictions, and we've got engagement coming up with New Zealand just next week on action and payment initiation at a government official level. So there's always an eye to it, but I think it's fair to say that the focus, is on, our own market, trying to get things right and working.
There as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, for this session, we have a focus on privacy and privacy enhancing technology. And like Camilla said, we'll break after this session for 15. So can I please welcome Bob from Token? And this Bob.
Hi.
Hey, Bob. I'll pass it on to you to take this over.
All right, great. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very clearly, Bob.
Okay, great. Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone on there, and greetings from New York, where it's cold. I'm Bob Trojan, and I'm the CEO of Token Insights, my policy advisory firm. And I'm also the co-Sherpa of the Data Ecosystem Work Group for APEC/Asia Pacific Financial Forum, which JC mentioned at the beginning. And so this work group is working on data privacy, data security, which are really kind of the flip sides of the same coin. And also, as JC mentioned, our goal for this work group is to document for the finance ministers this year what the principles for cross-border data privacy should be, and some ideas around privacy-enhancing technology. So I would like to thank all the panelists that we have heard so far today, because you have really informed that debate of what should go into those deliverables for principles for cross-border data privacy. I heard great concepts and words like customer focus, customer centric, trust, very important word, consent, accessibility, scalability, digital islands, and lots of dimensions within that. And so let's get to our awesome panel. We are going to be discussing, as mentioned, privacy and open data and privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs. And our panelists today are Edna Essien, who is the Director and Data Protection Officer for APAC for PayPal, and Jean DeMira, a well-known privacy expert and advisor at Northern Block. Unfortunately, Professor Lam could not join us today. So what we'll do today is we'll have each of the panelists share some remarks, some thoughts, and then we'll go to questions, either my questions as the moderator, or we'll open up the floor for questions there as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Edna, who will give us a practical perspective. Edna, you got the floor.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you can hear and see me okay.
Yes, we can. We can hear you very clearly.
Great. So I think whenever you're asked as a privacy practitioner to talk about data, people get very nervous, because I think they think, okay, she's going to tell us all about, what we can and cannot do with data, and all the rules around privacy. So for my sins, I've been doing, privacy on a global basis for coming up to 23 years, gosh. So originally from the UK, have advised various organizations around the, privacy requirements and the use of data. A lot of it in the tech industry, in banking, and now obviously in payments. And when I was asked to do this panel, I basically went back to basics. I thought about, the things I've heard about use of data over the years and how it relates to privacy. And what is the advice that I give when, PayPal or previous organizations have asked around data? And I always say that, the use of data may change, the way in which it's utilized may change, but the privacy principles, one thing I can say is that they remain constant. So I had a brief look, and I think it's been mentioned by previous panelists, around the open banking frameworks, the open data approaches across various countries. And let me start off with Singapore, which is where I'm based. So MAS, have issued framework and guidelines around open banking. So has Hong Kong, Australia, India, and Japan. So when I start off with those 5 countries, 4 out of those 5 have national privacy laws around the use of personal data of individuals. India is in the works. They do have, an IT law. They do have a small privacy law, but the national law we're waiting for is in draft. It is in Parliament. So fingers crossed, sometime this year, or early next year, we will have a national privacy law in India. So 4 out of 5 have these laws. So when I'm asked about open banking, open data, what am I thinking about? I am thinking about the things that you may have heard about when you speak to practitioners like myself, when you speak to your data protection officers, your legal team, you know, a compliance teams around privacy. It's around notice and transparency. You know, what are we collecting? What's the process and how are we intending to share? It's around choice and consent. You know, this is something that was mentioned earlier by the panelists. You know, in most regimes, we do give consent as a ground in which we share data, but as well as consent, you know, and I think this is something that is not, it's not new to privacy, but maybe new in certain APAC countries around legitimate interests. So when you're looking at open data and I'm being asked about the business and how we can, you know, monetize or utilize data, I look at the business and see, you know, what are our legitimate interests in comparison to the balance of the privacy rights of our consumers, of our employees, in terms of how we want to share data. You know, PayPal is involved in CDR in Australia. We had, as a data, you know, as a data provider, we are called by CDR.
I'm probably going to be talking in about 5 minutes.
Right.
Yes.
Sorry, I think Jean, you're not on mute. Jean is eager to get on after I finish. So, you know, we talk about CDR where we are involved and we talk about all these things. They don't go away, their collection, their retention. So I did a bit of analysis, you know, as a use case, you know, CDR being quite something that we've been involved over the last year or so. You know, if you look at the privacy safeguards, it has the same sort of principles that you'll find in privacy laws. You know, Privacy Safeguard 1 talks about open and transparent management of CDR data. You know, we must take steps to implement procedures, practices, systems, you know, to ensure compliance with CDR. Privacy Safeguard 2, anonymity and pseudonymity. So we must give consumers the option not to identify themselves or to use a pseudonym. Privacy Safeguard 3, you know, collection of the data from CDR participants. You know, we must ensure that, you know, we have in place all the measures to ensure that we only share data with accredited data recipients. Dealing with, you know, unsolicited CDR data. So when you talk about excessive data under privacy laws, you know, under CDR, we shouldn't collect data that is not required, and we're not required to retain it. You know, going all the way through to Privacy Safeguard 3 around notification, around disclosure, around getting consent, you know, and not using CDR data for direct marketing, for instance. All of this mirrors what we see pretty much in the privacy principles in GDPR, in the Privacy Act in Australia, in PDPA in Singapore, you know, all the privacy laws, you know, across APAC, across Europe, you know, is mirrored in these CDR privacy safeguards. And to me, as a practitioner, that means that although we're moving to a stage where data is being used in greater numbers, we are giving consumers the ability to move their data from one organization to another with as little hindrance as possible. The privacy safeguards don't go away. The governments need to work and are working with privacy regulators. They are seeking the views of privacy practitioners, of lawyers, to ensure that whatever framework is put into place, we are still respecting the rights and the privacy of individuals. And there's also an expectation from our users, from our employees, that when their data is being used, whether it's within open banking, whether it's within open data, whatever the use it is, that their privacy is still being protected. There's still security measures. You know, we are not just sharing data openly. You know, one of the panelists mentioned around encryption, you know, protecting the data. So what are the security measures that you're putting in place when you are openly sharing data? That still matters. I think if as an organization, we were to share data in all these frameworks without the protections being in place, you know, we're going to catch flack from our users because they will feel unprotected. They'll be worried about whether or not we are breaking their trust. That was a word that was utilized earlier. accountability, is a word that we've heard over the years around organizations being accountable in the way in which we use data. And within PayPal, we have policies and procedures around open banking. In particular, we talk about, if required, we will seek consent. So this is just generally across PayPal. We have requirements around, our teams having auditable documentation around source of data, data transfer, storage location, data attributes, data use cases, and metadata. So they need to be able to articulate that in writing so that in case it's required to be audited, they can actually produce the information around all these requirements for open banking. Data visibility, transparency, what is our ability to view, to add, to modify, to withdraw, users be able to withdraw their consent, the authorization to use self-service mechanisms, and the visibility that we provide to the users. Any team within PayPal that wants to use open bank and open data, these are all the things that they need to think through. And data quality, I think data integrity, receive either from users, from external third parties. We have an obligation to maintain the data quality because that's an expectation from not just our users, but also from regulators. So these are the requirements that we at a high level have provided to our teams to say, if you want to use data in this manner, in an open banking type situation, internally, in addition to the requirements being set by the regulators around CDR, around open banking, internally, these are the things that we also want you to think about. So I think what I always say when I advise teams is that irrespective of the data, irrespective of the amounts, so long as I and you can be identified from the data, those privacy principles that I alluded to earlier do kick into place. And my role is to advise on how best for us to use that data for the benefit of the company and the users. Bob, over to you, or to Jean.
Great. Thank you, Edna. Hey, that was great. What a really terrific overview of the various policy frameworks of various parts of the APAC region. And clarifying some of the expectations of not only the consumers, but also the regulators. So thank you. And so now let me turn it over to Jean, who will give his perspective and really look through various lenses of privacy and privacy enhancing technologies. Jean, you have the floor.
Great. And thank you. And my apologies, Edna, for that little blip on my microphone there. I was just trying to make sure it was off and did the absolute accident, which tells you like one little click of a keyboard and you can have an incident very, very easily into that mix. To keep me on track, I do have a couple of slides. These slides will be shared with the organizers and they'll definitely share them with you as well. So if some of the font is a bit smaller. My expertise is a bit more on the intersection with privacy principles together with information security and digital ID methods aligned with anti-money laundering and anti-financial crime controls. So one of the nuances that I just like to kick us off with is talking about open data and open finance empowerment by using and leveraging privacy enhancing technologies. As we're seeing the different open banking type of models that are going about in the different payment systems and their drive to be faster, more secure and adaptable, they want to make sure that we're hitting innovation standards and capabilities, but also keep that innovation strong angle open to allow for the creativity to go through. And the open finance and open banking is a great example where consumer data rights don't have to be really limited at the expense of security because of the interactions and the capabilities that are going over the rails in behind the scenes as open banking frameworks come in, that both sides tend to do a very strong validation of that the person is who they say they are, and they're respecting that person's data rights to grant them their banking information and the exciting different innovative tools that can kind of come with that. And that tends to leverage, those rails leverage critical privacy enhancing technology, whether they be VPN networks and other types of encryption capabilities, or other rails, including payment standards like ISO 222 and the like, that strike that balance of sharing the right amount of information between the different parties, being the customer and their financial institutions, or the customer and who they're making a payment to, into that mix, that strike the balance of the right amount of information goes that meets data minimization expectations, but also meets the anti-money laundering and anti-fraud controls. So striking those balances are going to be quite critical. And the default isn't necessarily, I love to hear about the wonderful world of right to be forgotten, and I completely agree with it. But to be a little bit controversial and talking in the privacy side of the fence, if you have a business need for information and you're providing business needs for clients, well, you need to take a look at your record retention policies in order to meet those needs. So right to be forgotten up to the point to business requirements and legal and regulatory requirements. There's always that caveat. But also what information that's being provided is quite important too. And please forgive my Canadian accent, but I'll give you a Canadian example as well. That was quite interesting, that just came in the last couple of weeks, where Home Depot, a hardware store that is quite prominent in Canada, ended up having a privacy commissioner finding whereby they were offering to send an email with someone's receipt for a purchase. And all you have to do is tag your email. It gets associated with your credit card. However, they were also using that email and they were sharing that with Facebook to see whether if their Facebook ads were efficient to drive someone into the store to buy that can of paint or that set of lumber. And the finding was, when somebody is providing their email address, it wasn't to give it to Facebook, it was to give them the receipt. So what is consent and what is implied consent? And that was a pretty good eye opener into that mix. Now, of course, Home Depot may feel that they had a business need to validate the quality of their funding and spend that they're doing into that regard. But we always have to take a look at this innovation and striking that balance with these privacy principles for the right of the consumer to make sure that they're feeling comfortable with what's going on into that mix. So these things always kind of follow themselves into different circles and different loops. Now, to take a little bit deeper in privacy enhancing technology, I put it right in the middle of this little table here. And again, if it's hard for you to read, and I appreciate it, for those in the room, it may be a little bit too fine point. I'll walk through each one of these and very quickly and talk through how privacy and open data sometimes have certain considerations as they're using some of the key different buckets of privacy enhancing technology. And trust me, this is not even a 101 course in PETs. These could be, there's quite a few different variations, especially with the different encryption techniques overall. However, as you're building out your infrastructure and your systems and your capabilities, it's the devil in the details and the process design that needs to strike that balance. And it also needs to strike the balance for your right purpose, whether if you're even a hardware store, or you're a bank, or if you're an innovative fintech, or any other type of organization. As soon as you have any personal information, you have to have some considerations. So the first bucket is in encryption techniques. These obviously are critical tools for us to protect potential breaches and facilitate third-party sharing. By each of you having your own unencryption keys, you can have the right balance of sharing that personal information, yet intruders to your networks, hopefully and ideally, wouldn't be able to extract that. Well, in the privacy considerations, are you encrypting enough? With the improved computational power that we're having, we have greater ability to encrypt more at a more efficient rate and hit larger databases into that mix. So it could be the right balance of encryption is becoming more and more of a powerful tool. However, on the open data side of the fence, it could impact how the analytics happen. And how much you're encrypting, are you over encrypting into some regards, could affect your accuracy and your transparency needs. If some of the data that's being encrypted are critical tools for reconciling the identity of a person, for example, and that third party is like a channel or a distributor, and both of you have anti-fraud and anti-money laundering obligations, then over-encrypting information transfer between the parties that doesn't unlock properly, or not everything is unwound, could cause criminals to slip through the cracks in some regards. So again, it's in the design. It's not that privacy is preventing that. It's how we execute on meeting these obligations that we want to make sure we strike that right balance. Data masking is another example where it's designed to minimize or protect sensitive information, and there's different replacement methods in data masking. I remember there was one particular project I was working for a very large firm, and the data security folks were insisting that we're data masking a particular project, and the project was about name matching, and we wanted to test the validity of fuzzy logic matching for the detecting criminals based on their names and terrorists. Obviously, if you data mask the information, it's impossible to do a match. So it was one of those things that that the insistence on following a check the box solution doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. And it was within protected environments and the like. So it was one of those things that sometimes people need to understand what controls do you have and how are they fit for purpose in order to protect the right people for the right things. You also have to take a look, is it complete enough? So for example, device identification details and IP addresses are becoming more and more critical tools, but then also those IP addresses, they could be masked by the consumer through VPN and other technologies. So the value proposition for traceability for those things, especially if they're constantly scrambled for a variety of different means, can really reduce their value. So you really need to understand the information, how's it being used, and into those areas, make sure it's complete enough when you're leveraging it for a variety of these tools. Sometimes these areas can end up causing a lot of data to really be to lose its value and its capabilities into that mix. So you need to work together to find out what are those right tools. Synthetic data or federated data methods, and sometimes this goes also towards consortium work that can happen, and leveraging artificial intelligence to work on models and create models and machine learning tools. We have to be careful that synthetic or federated data approaches don't accidentally cause biases in some of the analysis and design of work that we're doing. So all of these factors, you need to work as a team to do a lot of good testing and validation to make sure that you're meeting the end objectives of all of the different areas. So that's both the privacy side, the analytics side, as well as tangential teams and stakeholders into the mix. Now, one of the great news stories out there is that we're having a lot of amazing progression for a number of different disciplines. And when it comes to open data and open sharing, one of the biggest challenges that's being talked about is, well, we're improving our authentication and validation of is someone who they say they are. Does that person even exist? Are they a synthetic identity or synthetic person versus a real person? And into the mix when they come back, is it still them? All of those different elements of identity. And how do we find out if someone is who they say they are? Is a variety of different questions and capabilities of what we ask, but it's also by leveraging a number of different reliable sources using authenticated or validated records into that mix. So this is a mapping of identity assurance topics here. And the great news story about this is that this could really empower, if we have great trust of who's on the other end of that communication, then this could really empower that person having access to their information and data rights, because you know you're getting consent because you know who you're dealing with. But one of the challenges is if you don't have a strong assurance capability or identity validation capability, then are you sharing that information with the wrong person, with a criminal that is pretending to be Robert Trojan into the mix? Is that the real Robert Trojan or not? Is one of those capabilities. And a couple of the nuances that I think that sometimes get misunderstood are along that bottom path there is something it's the user on the other side self-confirming that they are who they say they are. Are they giving you knowledge-based information in order to validate they are who they say they are versus presenting things like a cell phone that has an IMEI code chip based on right from their chip into the mix that tells you, well, this is at least the same person that presented themselves before because we're matching to the same chip. Or are they using biometrics for facial capture and verification? Notice I didn't say facial recognition. Facial recognition is often construed as being one to many, where it's that one person out of a huge population, whereas the one-to-one of revalidating that it's still that same Bob because I recognize his amazing eyes and his smile and everything else, that I know that it's Bob. That's information capture and revalidation. That's strongly encouraged by the privacy experts worldwide because you're using it for security and validation purposes. That together with other tools, that together with the chip inside that what I have in my phone or other capabilities into the mix, and those things together with great custodian handoffs from either the banking institutions or ID records from a foundational records from a government or the telco validation relationship, their other utility providers or their employers. All these different trust custodians on the left-hand side, the more areas of trust you have together with the validation to source is what gets you to that strong confidence level. Now, what this tells me, though, is we really need to move away from knowledge-based validation because as we grant people access to information, they're going to have that knowledge. So if they breach at a very low level of assurance, that's where criminals can really attack because they could steal someone's mail and personal and confidential secrets. They could steal other records that can end even maybe get fake identification or synthetic identity off of someone by going to a compromise at a local driver's license issuance office where they're friends behind the counter. And they end up getting that fake ID of a real person. All of those different elements and tools really pose a risk that they then can collect more and more information, and that information has value in our current knowledge-based authentication processes. So to me, one of the things I'll call out is if your environment still has a very heavy knowledge-based authentication, either at the government level or other public sector areas, that's enough to get someone past controls without having physicality, without having other forms of verification, then I think that could be a challenge for your financial system and ecosystem in progressing and moving forward. Now, to walk through how much information do we need, and data minimization is obviously a key principle from a privacy standpoint, from an anti-money laundering perspective and anti-fraud perspectives, which have different sides of the coin, really, in many respects, of what they're trying to achieve and where they're going with things. There's different levels of assurance and validation that you need to provide, but there's also different tools in the tool chest to get there. And these examples here, they're typically levels of assurance, and most economies are talking about in a 4-level area, like I had on the previous graph. This talks through it. If you're in a very low risk product or very low risk service, you may just need to know that they're not a sanctioned entity, or they're not a criminal, or they're not a synthetic. And that core resolution could be used with very simplistic tools in a lot of jurisdictions and capabilities. Now, as they add more assets and more risk into or higher payment volumes or greater frequency of payments and the like, that's when you need to get greater resolution. You need to add more tools to the tool chest and mixing through things. But as you can see for this, the higher up you go into that path, there's less reliance, is the hope and dream on knowledge-based validation. So that risk-based approach from an anti-money laundering perspective and lining itself with levels of assurance is something not only that I've been speaking to in the last 4 or 5 years, but that theme has been echoed by FinCEN in the last 2 weeks as being a critical step forward in their increase in the United States for the customer due diligence expectations to potentially, there's a lot of talk that there's potentially adding device information as well as other traceable factors in their customer due diligence minimum requirements. And in Europe, the European Union's banking association just released some remote onboarding guidance, about 45 pages of great writing in my view, which talks through the increasing how much information you need lined up with that risk, which is directly aligned with privacy principles of data minimization strategy, but also improving the security and protection of persons and working through things of collecting more information only when you need it and keeping that protected and contained. And those are the key principles I had. Thank you for this great invitation, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
Great. Hey, thanks, Gene. That was great. And, thanks for boiling it down into such digestible pieces. You didn't even say some of the harder things to say, like homomorphic encryption and zero knowledge proofs and things like that. So I thank you for that. So we're open to questions from the floor. I also have questions for our panelists. And so do we have any questions from the floor?
Any questions from anyone?
I had one, Bob, and I heard about like tools, methods, practices. How many technologies are we talking about here for a financial institution? When you're saying privacy enhancing technology, what's the volume of footprint?
So how many different kinds of technologies?
Yeah, to make it real, to make it practical, open data world, volume of investment.
Oh,
well, maybe I can kick us off there. I really think when you say financial institution.
Sorry, as I say this, I also want to say about like 5 more minutes, time-wise, doing both time-minded role as well.
Yeah, so it's that risk-based approach. It depends on the institution. What we're seeing is empowering institutions and empowering banks, for example. They will have certain solutions that they will provide to its correspondents. And then they will have underlying solutions that they will hold for their money services businesses. So sometimes that investment may not necessarily be that everyone signs up to the same type of product. Sometimes it's empowering ecosystems that get thrown into the mix. One thing I didn't touch on here as well is the consortiums, where behind the scenes there's some great privacy enhancing technologies that allow for different groups of financial institutions to get together to the same ecosystem, and in a targeted fashion would end up battling things like synthetic identity frauds or account takeover frauds, or validation that an email address or phone number has not been abused or is not being leveraged as a takeover, and it has been detected as being tied to a criminal element versus a trusted one. So there's a variety of different tools, and there's consortiums of technology providers that are also building a lot of these tools together as well. So I didn't directly answer your question, but it depends is probably the shortest answer to that. But there's a lot of great initiatives that are going at various degrees of testing and various degrees of production into that mix.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great answer. Any other questions from the floor?
None
All right.
here.
I have one question for Edna. So how do organizations, balance? You mentioned balance. How do you balance, their commercial needs of an organization, like PayPal, the commercial needs to use data versus, the privacy obligations of a commercial entity. So what are your thoughts on that, Edna?
I mean, that's a question I ask myself every day. So whatever query I get through, whatever project I'm being asked to work on, Gene mentioned about data minimization. So my view always is that we can achieve the commercial side of the business. PayPal will not be in business right now. Banks, you know, you name it. Anybody that touches data will not in business right now if they're not able to do that. So my job is to make sure that if we are going to use data, even if there are restrictions, we can get around it, around transparency, for instance, around being transparent with our consumers. By the way, this is how we're going to use your data. You know, if you go on PayPal, you know, we have a section on privacy, so you can actually go through there and make it so easy for you to find out as an organization, how is PayPal going to use my data? When I have teams come to me and say, now we want to use data for a new purpose, my role is to also ensure that even if that's a new purpose, we are actually going to do it and tell consumers if we have a need to, seek consent if we have a need to. But the forefront of it all is that when you come to me and my colleagues, it's never going to be a no. It may be a maybe, and then we'll work through the maybe. And it's very important. At the end of the day, I'm also an individual. My data is with PayPal, is with banks. So I have an vested interest to ensure that the advice I give is in line with our legal frameworks, but also it is protecting that data. And that's what I care about. I don't really, you know, most people don't really have issues with their data being utilized to provide a service or product. They have an issue when that data gets involved in an incident, when that data is exposed, when that data is being used for purposes for which they're not even being made aware. So I think that for me is how you balance, you know, the organization's needs versus the privacy requirements of our individuals. Thanks, Bob.
Great, thanks. And, you know, I believe we are at time. So I'd like to thank our just awesome panelists, you know, for just a tremendous job. They're from Singapore and from Canada. I now turn you over to your host and then to your coffee break.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I agree with you. Very insightful session. We'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back with Holly Dorber from PayPal to talk about what needs to be done at a policy level. So 10 minutes break, everyone, and we'll be back soon. Thank you. Hey, everyone, we are back. I hope you can hear us. And for that last session, I'd like to pass it on to Holly from PayPal to introduce herself and take us through this session around policies and what do we need to do at G20 level. And welcome, sir.
Hello.
Sorry. Holly, over to you.
Thank you very much for having us this afternoon. And it's been a really interesting discussion that we've had over the past couple of hours. And I think, you know, hearing some of the themes coming out of this, and we talked about these guiding principles and a customer-led approach to open data, and learning as new regimes come online in different markets and different economies, the importance of industry consultation. They talked a bit about accessibility and security, and we've just had a really interesting session on privacy and security and the concept of trust. And one word that has been coming up is interoperability. And I think this focus for us in this session, we really wanted to sort of take a step back and from a more macro perspective, think about the policy issues and challenges to a regional and globally interoperable framework for open data, and thinking about the advocacy and influencing challenge that we face to really move toward cross-border data trade in a way that facilitates economic growth. And so we wanted to think about some of the barriers in this space, not just to developing principles and common language, but also to implementing policy to deliver on this objective at a regional and global level. And we are really fortunate to have some amazing experts with us today to discuss this topic. And I'll just take a couple of minutes just to read the bios so you know who we have on our panel, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion and throw some questions. So I'm really pleased that we have Karen Kuhlman with us today. Karen has a career more than 30 years in the private and public sector. Her area of expertise is IT, law and policy. She's currently the Director of Government Relations for IBM in Australia and New Zealand, and was appointed to the board of IBM Australia in 2014. She sits on a number of boards, state government appointment boards, and was also a past president of the Australian Services Roundtable for many years. Currently sits on the board as a director and a secretary of ASR, She's been appointed by various ministers across both sides of politics in Australia to advise on IT policy and issues across a range of areas. She's also been a co-chair of the e-commerce working group established by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I think all of that is relevant, but most relevant perhaps for the conversation we're about to have, Karen has represented Australia and Australian industry at international forums over the last 20 years, including APEC, UNESCO, the European Commission and the OECD. So we're really happy to have Karen making her time available to join us today. In the room, this is amazing, Trans-Tasman Digital. We've been doing this for a lot of years now, but let's see if we can make this work. We have Stephanie Honey. Stephanie is a trade policy consultant with expertise in digital trade, regional economic integration, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, the WTO, services trade, agriculture, trade and inclusion, and especially women and trade. She's previously worked as a New Zealand trade negotiator, including serving as chief agriculture negotiator during the intensive phase of the WTO Doha round, and is currently lead staffer for New Zealand at the APEC Business Advisory Council. And then I might also introduce Dr. Makoto Yokozawa, who we're really happy to have joining us. Dr. Yokozawa was leading a business informatics lab at Kyoto University until March 2020. He's now working at the Centre for International Economic Collaboration, which is an independent think tank in Tokyo, as CIO and board director. He is co-chairing digital policy groups in business at the OECD and B20 Digital Transformation Task Force, and is an ambassador to the Asia Pacific region in the ICC's Digital Economy Commission. I can't think of a more appropriate group of people with amazing expertise to talk about this topic. And so I thought, like, at a high level, if I might just initially ask each of our panelists, you know, when we think about this concept, we've been talking about it as open data frameworks and thinking about the issues that we each face, either as companies or governments, in establishing these frameworks for data sharing. But we think about it a lot as trade and services trade. And so I'm interested to hear the panelists' view on how far away we are from a world where services trade is as well understood by the right people who need to understand it as the trade in physical goods, and what are some of the key policy issues that we need to be thinking about in this space. So I might throw to Karen to start us off.
Thank you very much, Holly, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a really good question, and I think the best way to answer it is to look at the issue historically and think of where we were 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, I know from the work that we've done with the Australian Services Roundtable, it was very difficult to get both trade negotiators and domestic stakeholders at the political, ministerial, public service level in particular, to think about services trade in a way that was, they could see opportunities and they could see the value and they would get behind it and start initiatives. I think we've got challenges today, but the challenges we faced then were so much greater. There was never a belief that services was something that, could be traded, on its own. And I remember doing a briefing to one particular minister, and I wanted to talk about services trade, and she said, I know all about services. My parents worked in a milk bar, and when that bell rang, we would run to the counter, and services was my life. And so, I'd be surprised if you can tell me anything I don't already know about services. And, from there, we have now our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, along with Japan and Singapore, leading initiatives on e-commerce. The whole experience of COVID has shown us that not only do we have digital trade and services supporting the transfer of goods, but we have digital services trade of its own right becoming a significant part of the growth opportunities for all of our economy. So you can deliver digital services of architectural services, accounting services, legal services, medical services, entertainment, you name it. So we've come a long way. I do think that we've got some significant challenges ahead, and they are really now moving from the challenge of bringing the domestic into the international arena. I'm speaking only from my experience with DFAT. DFAT in Australia have some absolute experts on digital services trade. They understand the issues and they are prosecuting a very good set of arguments and bringing parties on board to explain the benefits for all players of interoperability, of global standards, of trade negotiations that lift all boats. What we're seeing the challenge to be is in the domestic sphere where policies, as they've always probably done, been developed with no reference to the international impact. So policies and legislation connected with issues of privacy, although less so, but encryption and related to skills development, related to standards within medical services delivery, dental service delivery, all of these, they're just being developed with a mind to the domestic market and not with a mind of what are our international obligations, how can we help this industry to be able to deliver these services digitally and globally. So at best, they're not turning their mind to the issue. At worst, I would assert there are some cases where they're actually coming very close to the wind and breaching our obligations that our DFAT friends have so well negotiated, because they're just not thinking about the impact of free flow of data localization issues, that they're just thinking about local security issues, local national security, local law enforcement, and local, dare I say, not protection issues, but industry development issues. So I think they're just not bringing that trade mindset, and I think that is a continuous challenge for us.
I completely agree. Stephanie, I might just throw to you and then Dr. Yokozawa, feel free to jump in after that on this one.
No. All right.
Thanks very much, Holly. And, of course, needless to say, I agree with everything that Karen said. I do think, it's actually perhaps even less optimistic than Karen's comment that it's not something, either services or digital trade, however you might define that, particularly widely understood. Of course, there are some experts working in trade policy who know it very deeply. But, in my experience of dealing with businesses, even some of those engaged in digital services trade might not necessarily recognise that they are themselves exporters and doing that sort of activity. And really, it's no wonder because, it's not the same as shipping a container of wheat or beef. It's a much more complex and nuanced and sort of subtle kind of trade. And I think that that really compounds the challenge for trade negotiators and domestic agencies in understanding the sort of holistic picture of some of these issues, engaging with stakeholders. I think as some of the commentators have said earlier in this seminar, there's a real process of educating stakeholders, if that's not too insulting a way of describing it, to really be speaking the same language about these things. But it does matter because, of course, for all of us in this webinar, it really matters how open data works because that's the business that we're in. But I think increasingly you can see in broader trade trends and economic trends that this is the future of the global economy. It is about the servicification of manufacturing. It is about digital trade and services trade. And we're seeing, sort of these slowdowns in goods trade, but at the same time, there's exponential growth in data flows and digital trade. So it really does matter. And I think, to pick up on something that Karen said as well, there's a really interesting nexus between what's happening domestically and what's happening in the sort of international collaborative space that really, makes this sort of session very valuable because there are domestic agencies, as Karen said, that are, developing their own policies. But that's not just within Australia or within New Zealand policies, but silos even within the economy where relevant regulatory settings or standard settings or whatever are not being done in a consistent way across the whole of the digital economy. And I know we're going to be talking about some of those new agreements later, so I won't go on about that. But, you know, I think there is a real need to take a step back and look at a sort of a holistic approach to some of these issues, to a digital trade strategy or whatever. Let me leave it there.
Dr. Yokozawa, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, okay, so thank you so much. And I should be very brief. And well, adding to that very nice viewpoints from the two panelists, I would add to the quick change recent years, or even this last year and this year, we observe a quick the change of the atmosphere about the role sharing in between the government and private sector. So I believe this this seminar is from the private sector view. So the very typical argument in OECD, and also we are going to expand this discussion to the APEC and the other fora, is the government access to data held by the private sector. So the OECD has released new principles in how the governments can access to the private sector data. So this is very important. As I said, the data is held in government data center, but much more in the private sector's data center. So if we talk about the open data, naturally we will have to think about how far the government can access to the data center in private sector. So they need this because the personal data and non-personal data, IoT data, and the social statistics are very, very valuable data, mostly held in the private sector. So this is the concept of how we can utilize the open data, even in the financial sector or the health sector. So this is very important things. And we are about to have a common rule setting or some common principles, firstly released by the OECD last year, last December. So this is a quite new argument. So this is a very typical style of how we can think about the role sharing between the private sector and the government. So that should be the most important thing, how we can support the G20 targets in terms of the open data. That's why I will stop here for the moment. Thanks.
I think that's really interesting, and maybe I'll throw this next one to Karen, and you touched on it a little bit just then as well. We're seeing sort of emerging as a theme, this theme of data as national security, and thinking about data sovereignty in the national context versus the economic value of data to grow the global economy, to enhance financial inclusion, to grow global trade and opportunity for people to access the global economy around the world. Who should be doing the work to make the case, almost to counter, subject to appropriate privacy and data security thresholds? Who should be making the case, and how should we be making the case for economic and social value of the free trade in data? How does that fit into these multilateral bodies and trade negotiations and statements on the digital economy that we're seeing coming out of certain markets?
It's a good question, Holly. I think it's incumbent upon industry really to lead the charge, and that's why ABAC and related bodies are so important. But they and Australian Services Roundtable and various others, that understand the trade issues, understand the trade environment globally. There's some terrific academics as well that are doing some very, very valuable work on the economic value of digital trade, in particular, and services trade. But there is always that the easy path for domestic governments and policymakers is to take a conservative view and stretch the limits of what's required in order to protect, for example, national security. Now, I don't think there's anyone sensible person that doesn't believe that there should be legitimate exceptions for national security, and same with law enforcement. That is quite a proper thing for governments to try and achieve. But what we're seeing is that there's a tendency for governments to throw all of the data into the one category and not allow for divisions of different types of data. And you get regimes like the critical infrastructure regime, you get proposals like the cloud hosting certification, which really treat all data that company like IBM, who I work for, all data that we hold for them as needing to have the highest levels of national security protection. And in fact, if it's material that's on websites, if it's material related to a public submission process and lots of other associated very general informational material, it doesn't need that level of protection. And so you are then ending up with these huge carve-outs. And, look, it is a difficult argument, it's a complicated argument, but it's an argument that I think industry really must pursue. Because otherwise we'll have so many exceptions to the commitments to free flow of data in the public sphere that it will be, meaningless. And when you have meaningless international commitments, then you start to weaken the whole process. So to get back to the first answer, I think industry really does have to do or continue to do the hard work here and accept that carve-outs are required for legitimate purposes, but not allow government to just throw everything in those buckets to make life, simpler and easier and perhaps even cheaper, but actually look at what really does fall within those exceptions and what doesn't.
Yeah.
That'll be my overall response.
Yeah.
Others may have a different view or want to add to the perspective.
No, maybe I think. I mean, these are really big issues. And I think the thing for us, sitting in this room and having this conversation today, these will take time. But part of the challenge and the key to success will be really understanding our stakeholders. And I think, Stephanie, I was interested in your experience. Where can we make the most progress? How do we identify the key stakeholders who are actually influencing these things? And, we're talking about mandates and common principles and language, and really the rubber hits the road in the text of agreements, whether they're coming out of ministerial statements or in the text of trade chapters, and this is a whole sort of other world for most people who are working on domestic policy advocacy. The trade world for advocacy is you've just got to start all over again, because it's like trade people speak their own language. I don't think that's offensive. That's certainly my experience. I maybe understand 0.5% of it. But where can we make the most progress? And thinking about the APEC context, who should we be looking to as sort of the champion economies? And is that the right approach?
Thanks, Holly. Great question. And I guess I'd like to answer in a couple of different dimensions. Firstly, it's important that we bear in mind that this is not a static situation that we're talking about, unfortunately. A lot of what's been discussed in this session today has been around how do we open up, how do we create the right enabling environment, how do we achieve interoperability. That's fantastic, and that's something that needs to be done. But it's also the case, unfortunately, a little bit of a sort of old wine in new bottles. We're also increasingly seeing the rise of protectionism in the digital economy, in this space, in particular around data flows. So not only is there the conversation that needs to be had about what's the enabling environment and how do we achieve that, but we also need to be trying to unpick the restrictions that are being imposed. If you look at some of these sort of international metrics around, for instance, prepared by the OECD on services trade restrictiveness or digital trade restrictiveness, those are heading in one direction, which is increasing, ironically, at the same time as we're becoming increasingly dependent on digital trade and services trade. So that conversation also needs to be had. But to your question about, well, how do we actually shift the dial here? I do think, we've heard very powerfully through earlier today, and it's certainly a very important part of the work that I do with ABAC. There really does need to be a free-flowing conversation between industry, regulators, and other stakeholders in this conversation to understand the nuances, understand what are the actual points of friction for businesses, which, as a former trade negotiator, I feel able to sort of say this. You might think you know it all, but actually, until you're actually in the real world doing it, you perhaps do not appreciate what actually matters to a business. So I think sessions like this are incredibly valuable to deepen our shared understanding, but also the incredible work that JC does with the Asia Pacific Financial Forum, the work that ABAC more broadly does. In ABAC, we have this incredibly, valuable and unique conduit straight through to the leaders at the end of every year and to the finance ministers. That is incredibly important to be able to articulate what matters to business. And, I think we need to keep pressing on. It's sometimes, I'm sure JC will agree with me, a little depressing that we often, give the same messages in a very powerful way each year. And it takes time to get the conversation going, but it's worth doing because it does really matter.
Dr. Yokosara, I might see if you've got any views on this topic as well, because you've got some interesting perspectives.
Okay, I should be very super short again. Yes, just thinking about the multilateralism versus multi-stakeholderism, I totally agree what has been discussed by the two panelists. And this, I would add a little bit more about how we can replace the common issues in WTO, that is the very big, the maximum institute, a number of the countries just joining in the WTO context. But we have an alternative approach. Even in New Zealand, you have the DEPA, with Chile and Singapore, that's microlateralism. So, and maybe some more the plurilateral negotiation should be an easier way to have a common understanding and the like-mindedness in the trade negotiation. So that's one thing. We can just try to find the who will be the like-minded countries, like-minded people. This is the first thing. The second thing is in Singapore, they had a great experience in the regulatory sandbox approach. So this is something to note if we want to find a good solution in this the very difficult time. So there, even the private sector can join and share the experience very much in the. Sorry, that's me. Thank you for that. Yeah.
It's interesting. If I think about the earlier sessions that we've heard today, there was a lot of talk about use cases and the different regimes. And I think I mentioned this at the beginning, different markets are learning from different regimes. And as they're coming on, they're adapting these regimes and tweaking them. And it's almost counterproductive in a sense, because you're getting further away from an interoperable framework for open data, because it's almost like markets are sort of trying to refine and improve the predecessors. If you think about the UK sort of started this, and around the region, and we heard about Southeast Asia is actually quite close. It does seem like there is a bridge that can be that we can be bridging, but it's almost counterproductive. And so maybe an action for stakeholders like us in this group is to think about use cases across markets and use cases in an interoperable context. What do they actually look like? And then take those forward as specific things we can be advocating for, and highlight where there are challenges or differences in the regimes in different markets that prevent that cross-border interoperability and the free flow of data in an open data, open finance context. Probably like Q&A, that's more of a comment than a question, but if anybody wanted to jump in, that would be fine.
Well, Holly,
yes, yeah, jump in. Yeah,
I'm just going to jump in on that because it just reminded me as you're talking about interoperability and how far we have moved from the whole goods and trading goods space. Because if you're exporting or importing for that matter, but bananas or peanuts or whatever it is, the issues are well understood by the industry players, and it's pretty clear to government as well. You also don't have a huge a consumer stakeholder group that are relevant to that environment. You want to sell your bananas and, you want to get them on boats and you've got to go and you've got to get through customs and all that sort of stuff. But it's a fairly simple process. In the whole world of digital trade and technology, there are multiple uses and stakeholders. And so that the issue becomes even more complex. And I'm referring now to the comment by Julia Sheldrake, who sort of asks about, well, what about the consumer issues? And I only mentioned industry, but consumer groups and people that are looking at that consumer perspective, they're also very important in this whole digital trade environment because, how big tech, for instance, is used and can be, provide consumer protections and standards. It really is the rubber hitting the road when those services are used globally, and yet most consumers are only consuming them in a domestic context. It is quite a different paradigm, and the challenge for in both a multilateral and bilateral, but mostly multilateral environment is, well, how do you protect the integrity of domestic marketplaces and domestic lawmakers and their ability to develop policies and laws that are relevant and appropriate and reflect the views of, their communities, and at the same time achieve interoperability and achieve international standards and achieve this concept of what we think is, fair and equitable on that global scale. It brings everything to that into focus, and it's, you've got 180 countries around the world, all with a slightly different perspective. So it's really extremely challenging, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it, because the alternative is, it's a hodgepodge of poor opportunities for, both consumers and industry.
Could I just jump in there, Holly, with that? I know we're nearly out of time, but just a quick comment. You commented that this plethora of individual approaches, country-specific approaches, economy-specific approaches is a problem, and it certainly is if you're trying to export or operate in, across multiple markets. That said, there is also a bit of a tradition of regulatory competition, helping to sort of refine down to the optimal approach. But I'd like to pick up on something that Mac mentioned, which is there is a model out there that is actually trying to bring all these different ideas together in a sort of a digital trade beauty contest, if you like, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is deliberately designed and intended as a building block to a sort of broader outcome. The three economies that are part of it now are definitely out there proselytizing and saying, join deeper, hoping that it will expand. And there are, three other economies or more probably who are seriously interested in joining. And it is created as a platform to enable this sort of conversation, but among the regulators and the trade negotiators to think, well, how is it that we design a good interface mechanism, if you like, between our different regimes to enable essentially trade to flow, data to flow, consumers to benefit across different markets. And, I think that sort of model that's designed as a sort of a little snowball rolling down the hill, gathering momentum and creating ultimately a more sort of interoperable digital economy in the region or globally even, is really quite a good model that we could be, advocating for.
Just Just if
Yeah,
I
jump
make
in.
a very short comment. Yes, thank you for just citing me. That's a great point. And the reason why we need the microlateralism and the quick formation of the like-minded negotiation is that in digital, especially, the things can be changed very, very quickly compared to the past 10 years ago. So the technology is changing, and the financial application is also changing. So that is why the government only the government cannot cope with. So this is also why they need the public sector, our experience, our idea. So that's a natural thing for us to think about the smaller group and find the like-mindedness in this region, Asia Pacific region. So that's me. Thank you.
I'm mindful of our time, and I'm wondering whether we might open up to questions from the room. I think there's a comment in the chat, which I'm happy to read out, see if anybody wants to respond to it, around data localization requirements, making accessing global services more restrictive and expensive, adding complexity on the technical side too, as cloud providers may not have local infrastructure in every market. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that on the panel, but I feel...
I'll just say something quickly, that is a classic example of where you might have an industry minister, in the past at least, wanting to develop a local industry, wanting to develop skills and thinking this is a pathway to achieving that. And it's quite a legitimate thing to want to develop skills in these, IT areas. But the pathway to doing it is actually probably going to achieve the opposite. It's going to, lead to, certainly from a multinational point of view, added costs, and it's a disincentive to invest in that market. So, it's a case where, domestic policymakers are thinking about what they can do in their space, but not looking at that broader investment impact, from the point of view of those, the way in which the world does work. So it's a good point, and I think it's been mentioned several times that data localization, is actually at the end of the day contrary to digital investment.
I can't see the room, so I might just ask if there is any question in the room.
Any questions from the room? No, Holly, there's no questions from the room at this moment.
All good. Then I think we've kept right to time. Unless any of our panelists have any closing remarks, happy to end it there. I think there is a lot more that we can do to take this conversation forward, and I think more conversations like this, and sort of taking the next step and thinking about the actual language and what do we want to see written down. How do we get the mandate to do that? These are the big challenges that we have going forward. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Dr. Yokozawa. It's a real privilege to host this session today, and thanks to Camilla and everybody at EPA Asia.
Thanks a lot, Holly.
Thanks all. Thanks, Holly.
No, thank you, Holly, and that was very insightful. And I think especially for me, understanding the relationship between trade, data, and services, it's an intriguing combination, and you've done a very good job like explaining what it means and the challenges there. So thank you so much. We are close to time, so if I can pass to Camilla and JC to close the session.
So before I hand over to Daisy to do the close, I just want to say thank you to everybody on the line for staying on, listening to those interesting panels, having some time there in the chat, but we always would like those sessions to be more interesting. I should be on this side to be more interactive than they are when you do virtual. But please reach out if you have something you would like to add or suggestion how we take this forward. And also to you in the room, we would like to have had the chance to have it more interactive, but we going afterward for some networking, and then we can exchange some ideas. What I wanted to add though is that I hope that today was a little bit confusing how we threw those topics together, because we want us to think a little bit broader.
when Saurabh and I have been discussing before we did our presentation at Singapore FinTech Festival, we talked a lot about we're living in the region that have the most mobile population. And what Sonia referred to, that we want to create services that helps people maybe when they are abroad or when they're moving at that point in time where there is a critical need. And hence we need to broaden how we're thinking around it. And that's why we added this around the services and trade agreement, because it actually is where we create value. So I hope you go away and have some few new ideas, and also with privacy enhancing technologies, that sometimes when we see bottlenecks, we might have to look at it from a different angle. So that's what we wanted to create here today. And we'll share a report, and in the report will also be our messaging from the working group, where we're taking this for the rest of the year, because we're working our way through a series of workshops with a message that we're delivering today back, I think it's towards July, August, to actually be included in the APEC round in October. So that's all from me. We can never do those sessions without your support, thought leaders, specialists, private sector, public sector, KPMG, everyone. Thank you very much from EPAA. And Jason, do you want to say something before we go to refreshments?
Okay. Yeah, normally closing remarks are fairly easy, but this is a bit difficult because I don't know where to start. But I think we talked a lot about what's important, in developing our recommendations to APEC. So we've talked about the importance of the ecosystem approach, because it requires collaboration, and also because developing open data, open banking systems, these are things that require a lot of time. This will take time, but it's important to get it right. I think that's one of the messages that we had. So take time and make sure that we get it right. And to get it right, I think the collaboration is very important, especially incorporating the perspectives of the key stakeholders that we talked about, for example, those who are involved in the technological, the banking, and the legal aspects. You need to bring them together. So this is something that governments alone cannot do, but it must engage the industry and different parts of industry that are critical for the success of open data. We also talked about customer centricity. This is, I think, another very important aspect. And this is very important because it deals with privacy, data privacy, which is very important for consumers, and transparency. Then we talked about the importance of standards. I think that's an important part of the work that we need to do. And we also, I think, came to the conclusion that in many cases, economies in the region are still in the building phase. So at this point, there's really not much we can do directly on a regional basis, but I think it's very important to develop the open banking and open data systems with a view to the benefit of consumers across the region. And that's why it's very important to really look at common principles and we have discussed a lot of things that could go into this work. So I think going back to the importance of data to customers, consumers, there's also a very huge amount of work being done on data privacy, and this is something that goes parallel to what we're doing in open data. So on February 22, we're going to have a big discussion on data privacy and privacy enhancing technologies in Washington, DC. We're going to have another discussion on that in Singapore, I think on April 24. And we're discussing that with APEC groups, including the data privacy subgroup of APEC. So I think it's very important to coordinate this work with the work that we're doing in open data. These are two huge chunks of work that are being done in parallel, involving various experts in these fields. But with some people who are So what are the next steps? So next steps, we will report the outcomes of these discussions in ABAC, the Economic Integration Working Group, which Stephanie is handling. And so we're very happy that Jane has volunteered to make this report and to be our guest, ABAC. And then we will be continuing our consultations with various APEC officials. And this will be with a view to developing a document that will provide our recommendations on the development of open data, especially on a cross-border basis. How do we work together in order to provide systems that would lead towards future interoperability? And so I'm we're counting on Camilla and her friends to do that. There will be another roundtable once we have finished this document as a first draft to discuss it. I think on May 9, right? We have scheduled it around that time.
Yeah.
So we will have that discussion again, but with a more concrete set of proposals on how we move forward and how we suggest to APEC to move forward. And then in July, ABAC will finalize our recommendations, and hopefully this document can be made an annex in our report to finance ministers. And it will also be referenced in our report to the APEC leaders when they meet in November. So we will also be throughout this process engaging with various APEC working groups in order to get more people to understand what we're doing and to be able to find a way for APEC to collaborate together on this. Now that is easier said than done because, as you know, governments are very siloed. So you've got different ministries, agencies working on different things, but there are overlaps. And the difficulty has always been trying to get them together to work on something. Now, in different economies, I think there's an increased realization of the need for collaboration. So that's happening already. In Thailand, they set up a ministry that's just focused on digital and coordinates everything. In Japan, for example, they've introduced a lot of inter-ministry collaboration. And it's something that governments are aware of. But that is reflected also in APEC. In APEC, there are many working groups. So I started out only attending the finance ministers meetings, finance officials meetings. But now, because the issues are cross-cutting, I have to attend many meetings. So economic committee, digital economy steering group, data privacy subgroup, and all of these things. So it's really more work. But I think APEC also understands this issue. And so they're also trying to find a way to have discussion of cross-cutting issues across the various working groups. So we're trying to move them towards that, especially with the focus to the issues that we're working on, like open data. So that's the work that lies ahead of us. I cannot end my remarks without thanking